tried just to sit back and just allow the Watchmen to speak, and I listened. But one thing that really impacted me was the fact that there were three men in the meeting, Michael Bodea, Augusto Perez, and you, who either escaped communism and or fascism, or their families escaped it. And it wasn't like, 3-4 generations back. It was like, no, my father and mother, or me. I mean, Michael Bodea, his grandfather, Dumitru Duduman, Augusto Perez, he and his family escaped Cuba after the communist revolution. And as I listened to Michael Bodea talk about how his family escaped Romania and the tyranny of the communists, and I listened to Augusto talk. I mean, Augusto was telling us firsthand stories of what it was like to escape, what they had to endure, what the roadblocks, the obstacles, the problems that were put in their path as God was telling them to leave, to flee the tyranny that had taken over their country. And I sat, I was gripped by these stories. And then you surprised me with a story about your family. Take a few minutes and tell our listeners about your family's escape from tyranny.
My father grew up in Croatia, and then, of course, it became known as Yugoslavia after World War II until more recently it once again became Croatia. He was, and his family had about 1 to 2 days' notice. The communists, at the time they were called the partisans there in Croatia and Serbia in that area, they were closing in from one side, and Hitler's Nazis were closing in from the other. And the villagers in the area where my father lived, not too far from Zagreb, were caught in between. And they were told they had to choose sides, either join the communists or the Nazis. Well, there's a real choice for you. So those people who didn't want part of either only had one option left, and it was to run for their lives. And that's what Dad and his mother and sister did. His father had died just a few months earlier, and of a sudden heart attack at age, I think, 42 or 43. It was completely unexpected. So Dad had to become somewhat the head of the house. Really, he was doing a lot of the hard chores on the farm there and everything. And then on top of that, now they, were given word that they had to choose sides. And so they decided, after praying about it, and they were Christians by then, they and some villagers decided they were going to form a wagon train, throw a few of their personal belongings on the backs of these wagons. Some of them were horse-drawn, others with oxen and donkeys, whatever they could get, and they ran for their lives and left everything behind, lost their farms, 90% of their belongings, and only had a little bit of money with them. And they traveled north through some towns that had already been bombed, others that were getting ready to be ravaged, and he saw things as a 12 to 13-year-old that no one should have to. But I remember him telling me they went through some towns where there had just been tremendous bloodshed, and houses were still on fire, and he had to help clear bodies out of the streets just so they could go through with their wagons. Just saw unspeakable atrocities.
And how old was your father at this time?
He was either 12 or 13, right at that age, early teenager.
And he was leading the family at that age?
Well, his sister was frail, and he had lost 2 other sisters during the war due to disease, and so his mother relied heavily on him, and he had to do the bulk of the work together with his mother, and again with his father having died. And so, you think some people think they have it difficult, but imagine a 12 or 13-year-old who just lost his father and now having to step it up and then having to flee their house on top of it.
How did he lose his father, your grandfather?
It was a heart attack. They believe it was because Grandpa helped a stranger whose wagon broke down out in front of their house, and he lifted heavily to try to help him get the wheel back on, and that possibly that might have led to it because he died in his sleep that night. And just a sudden heart attack. So yeah, it was.
Now you told me a story about your grandfather. Is this the same grandfather?
No.
That's the other.
I'll keep going and tie that together.
Yeah.
So Dad and his family and a number of the villagers there made it into Hungary eventually, and then traveled through Hungary up into the mountains of Austria. His story parallels the Sound of Music quite closely. It's amazing. They actually ended up hiding out in the mountains near Salzburg, Austria. They could speak German. He was trilingual. He could speak German, Croatian, and Russian, so they could blend in some of the German-speaking areas, but they didn't want anything to do with the Nazis, of course. And Austria, is divided. Some of the people there had become hardcore Nazis. The others were resistant. But they found a pocket there where they could stay and live as refugees. But Dad began attending a trade school there, and this was about a year before the war ended. But he and his friend, walking past the principal's office, heard him speaking, and they overheard him. And my dad realized, and his friend, that they were there simply to be trained for the Hitler Youth, and they were planning to put these 13, 14-year-old kids on the Eastern Front to fight for Hitler. And so once Dad found out about that night, he and his friend jumped out of a two-story window and ran for hours. It was a boarding school. They ran for hours to get back near their homes because they didn't want to be put on the Eastern Front, obviously, and fight for Hitler. And so Dad was smart enough. He had to be street smart at that point in time with everything they had gone through. He was smart enough to realize that the Gestapo would soon be on their tails, realizing that they were missing from the school, and so he didn't want to go all the way home because they'd probably be looking for him. And sure enough, that was the case. So they watched from a nearby hillside in the woods, and saw the Nazi police come ask his mother questions and so forth, and so Dad was able to sleep in a hayloft in a neighbor's barn, and he stayed there for, if I remember right, for several weeks, if not a month or more, until the coast was finally clear and the police stopped coming to look for him. And then he finally went back home, and soon after that the war ended. It was in the final days of the war. And then from there, a few years later, they went ahead and moved into Germany to get work because Germany was desperate for manpower to rebuild after the war. And Dad's goal, along with his cousins, was to work for a few years, save up enough money, and then to come to America. Well, while in Germany, and in the southern part, it was in the Swabian Alp region, close to the Swiss border, that's where he met my mother. She was a German girl, grew up under Hitler during the war, and it was her father, my grandfather on my mother's side, who was so outspoken against Hitler that Mom and Grandma feared for his life and prayed for him daily. And had it not been for the fact that they lived in a small town of 300 or so where everybody knew each other, and it was a mostly Christian village, he probably would have been killed. In fact, I found out a couple of years ago, I didn't know this until more recently, that at one point the Gestapo came into town looking for Grandpa and wanting to do who knows what with him and get him out of there. But the mayor of the little village told them something, who knows what, and maybe sent them on the wrong trail or got them to leave. But it helped that my mother was best friends with that mayor's daughter. They're almost like family. And so, the Lord intervened on different occasions to spare Grandpa's life.
But your granddad was openly challenging Hitler.
He was, and now this is Germany, and you have to understand, maybe some Christian listeners are offended by this, but in Germany, in that little village, even among the Christians, most of these believers, they would have a goblet or two of wine with their evening meals. And
Grandpa, just cultural. That's a cultural.
Grandpa, yeah, Grandpa. he couldn't handle a lot of that, and if he would just have a little bit of it, he would just talk everything that came to mind, and he didn't hold back. And going back to Germany, and
I talk about Obama, and I don't have to drink anything. I don't know what I'd say if I was drunk.
Talking to neighbors, they now looking back, they would have a laugh. And I did talk to some of their older friends who were still alive, some of them in their 90s now, and they would say, yeah, he would, call Hitler every name in the book and tell everybody what he thought about him, and they would always say, shh, Heinrich, be quiet. Somebody might hear you, so you're going to get into trouble. And, of course, there was the one outspoken Nazi in the village who was the school teacher. And
of course.
He was
Where
there.
Did they put the Nazi? In the school.
Yeah, he was there, on assignment to indoctrinate the kids, and
he was there on assignment. That's the key thing, what you just said. They put the Nazi in the school system.
Sure. There to indoctrinate the kids, but also to listen to see what was going on in town and to report. And I'm sure he was probably the one that sent the Gestapo there to look for Grandpa. It's probably him.
Where's the best place to get information? From children. Mm-hmm. If you just, if you're a teacher or a principal, you're going to hear all kinds of things all day long from out of the mouths of children.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, that's what they did. And to show you how quickly things went, Grandpa traded with a Jewish man, livestock. And all of a sudden one day that Jewish man didn't show up anymore. And Grandpa sensed that something was going on, but they didn't have a clue. Literally, they didn't have a clue till after the war, the magnitude of everything that happened. They just knew Jews were disappearing, and there were various blackouts on some of the events taking place in the bigger cities, but there was a lot of anti-Semitic propaganda. That was obvious. But they lived in a small Protestant village near the Swiss border up in the hills, and they were basically German hillbillies, and they knew that Hitler was bad. They disagreed with what he was saying and what they thought he was doing. But it went very quickly. And what people need to realize is this. The top German Christian leaders, they were done away with by Hitler early on. When he was getting ready to make his move, in a matter of a couple of days, he got rid of hundreds of Christian leaders. His police would show up in the middle of the night when neighbors were asleep, and cart off families and some of their leaders, and before people knew what had happened, they were leaderless. There were, I'd say, probably 80% or more of what we would call the evangelical German leaders were rounded up very quickly and early on.
And then they were replaced by Nazi pastors. They were fake pastors.
Yeah.
The Nazis brought their own church pastors into the denominations.
But also some of the other smaller leaders who were left, and other decent people who were Christians who knew right from wrong, they were in essence left without leadership, standing around looking at each other like, what do we do now? Because they had been following certain leaders, and now those leaders were gone. And I've been asked before by people, and I've wondered myself, how could the things that happened in Nazi Germany have happened with so many Christians living there at the time? And that's how it happened. Hitler designated certain people up front pretty quickly. He knew who his enemies were. He was able to effectively get rid of a lot of them very quickly and then intimidate the others to stay silent with some success. There were still those who spoke out, but not as many.
Gary, I am very apprehensive that such a thing is going to happen in America in the very near future.
Well, I am too, Rick. In fact, that's why I felt led to share this and to go into this degree of detail, because I feel we are living at a stage right now in America that's very reminiscent of what happened in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. And that concerns me a great deal from a historical perspective. Growing up, hearing my parents' stories and my parents' cousins and what they went through, and sharing about these things at family reunions, and looking at what is going on today and some of the executive orders being put in place by the current administration and other things that trouble me. Believe me, I'm with you on that. I believe that we are approaching that point pretty quickly, more quickly than what people might think.
In one night, U.S. special forces teams could apprehend hundreds of Christian leaders, patriot leaders, Tea Party leaders. It could happen in one night. One night. They could fan out across the nation, kick open doors, drag people out, they're gone, and nobody will say a word about it. Nobody. Yeah. Do you think, Gary, if guys like you and me and Steve Quayle and Augusta Perez, and I could go down the whole list, do you think if guys like us were rounded up one night that the Benny Hinns and the Joel Osteens are going to come looking for us?
No, not a chance. If anything, some leaders that aren't speaking up as they should now, they would probably back off even further and do less and try to preach more of a positive message.
They'd be terrified.
They'd be terrified. You better believe it. And the thing is, too, we're living in a society now, and this has changed very quickly. I mean, in one generation, America's been turned on its head. You look at what happened last week with the endorsement of same-sex marriage by our president. Good is being called evil and evil good. And Christians who do take a stand for righteousness, they are now viewed as being politically incorrect and intolerant and unloving, even though we're not unloving. We do have a love for the truth, and most of us, I feel, share in a loving way with people, but we're calling people to repentance, to repent of their sins. And there are those leaders in our nation today who don't want to hear that, and they see us as obstacles, and they hate us.
Gary, have you seen this week's Newsweek magazine front cover?
Just saw the cover.
Obama with a rainbow color halo and the words, America's first gay president. And of course they're saying he's the gay president because he's the most pro-gay rights president. I think that they're actually preparing for the day he is going to come out of the closet and admit he is gay. I really do. I think he is going to be the first gay president. That's speculation, but I think there's more to it than just because it didn't say America's first pro-gay rights president. It said America's first gay president. I think the guy has AIDS, quite frankly. If you look at him, his physical appearance is worsening, and I think it's very possible the man has AIDS. But whatever is going on spiritually, the American people, whether you claim him as your president or not, doesn't really matter. He is legitimately or illegitimately in the office of the White House, of the presidency, and he is the recognized leader of the United States of America, and he is a reprobate. He is a total reprobate. He's got a spirit of Antichrist on him, and he is leading this nation in open rebellion towards God.
Yeah.
And the Lord the Lord God cannot ignore this any longer. It's reached the point now that the sexual perversion in this land is so gross and so out in the open now. I don't watch TV. I hate it. All right, I can't stand it. But if it's on, if I'm in a room and it's on, it's like you can't watch it for 5 minutes without hearing something about homosexuality.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the openness and the open acceptance of it. And even on some of the more conservative channels, for the most part, the nation has reached the point now publicly where it's become accepted, where it's no longer to be opposed. And, Obama said his position has been evolving, and what I believe that simply means is he was waiting for the polls to show that a majority of Americans agreed with him, and then he would do what was politically expedient, but hold back until that time. I mean, I think we all knew where he really stood on this all along, but recent polls, two of them, have shown that between 50 and 55% of Americans now are not opposed to same-sex marriage, and so now he's come out in favor of it. Tony Blair, by the way, did the same thing just a few weeks ago, endorsing Cameron, Prime Minister in the UK, who wants to make legal same-sex marriage by, I think it's 2015, all across the land, within the next two years or so. And So I think that also emboldened Obama to do what he did. But
this is a global agenda. This
Yeah.
is part of the United Nations agenda. This nation after nation is being pressured to go this direction. But what are the spiritual consequences, Gary?
Well, where I was going with this is that the truth has been turned upside down, and where once we operated under a Christian ethic in this country, even if people weren't believers, there was a predominant Christian ethic in our legal system and in the decisions that were being made. Now that's been turned on its head, and suddenly we're the enemies. Anybody who doesn't embrace everything that comes along and takes some kind of stand for righteousness, we're the enemies now, because the whole New World Order, it's all about unity, a false unity, a coming together of all the people, all the religions of the world, all the sinfulness, everything, doesn't matter what it is, all coming together as one to be part of this global system that will then be ruled over by the Antichrist. And I believe all that is not far off. And, it's not far in the distance. And so Christians who take a stand, they have to be dealt with somehow, because you can't have a new world order that they are wanting to have and yet have Christians voicing their strong opinions and beliefs constantly as a reminder of the truth. They have to be dealt with. And we're getting very, very close to that point. And I personally believe that will probably be the next thing that happens. I would not be surprised, and I'm not going to set any dates because that's in God's hands, but in the not-too-distant future, I wouldn't be surprised if in this country there is some type of internal uprising or conflict, some type of crisis. And there are so many ways that it could be brought about. It could be brought about by Tea Partiers and going at it with the Occupy protesters. There could be racial tensions involved. There could be sudden, unexpected terrorist attacks in a few places in our country, whatever. And it would make it easy then for the President of the United States to declare a state of martial law. And at that point, that would be a perfect opportunity to round up Christians or people who've been taking a strong stand against the policies of the administration. And from there, things would go downhill very quickly.
And they will be rounded up under the guise of national security. The official story will be those people who were detained for security purposes were a threat to public order.
Right.
And because they know that those leaders would publicly, like I would on the radio, tell people this is martial law. This is the suspension of the Constitution. This is now a dictatorship. And so those kind of people would be rounded up, and they would simply say, this is for the preservation of public order. Those voices that we detained were causing disruption. They were causing panic. They were causing rumors to be spread. They're not going to round us up and say, they're Christians and we're going to shut their mouths. They're going to say no. They were threats to public order.
Yeah, and I believe that time is coming. And when it does, in my opinion, there are maybe three things that would really get God to the point where He would bring judgment against this nation. One is all the innocent blood that's been shed. 70 million abortions now in the U.S. Through our policies being responsible for at least a couple 100 million others around the world, because we've attached our financial aid, foreign assistance, to whether or not countries are willing to allow abortions or not. And many people are not aware of that. But for a number of years now, countries overseas, in order for them to get money from us, there are strings attached to it, and those are some of them in most instances. So there's that element. There's the factor with Israel, and the Obama administration twice in the last couple of months has betrayed Israel. One of those, very obvious, Israel had negotiated and spent a lot of money paying Azerbaijan to be able to use one of their runways for a quick strike against Iran, probably in the middle of the night, so that nobody would even know what happened, to knock out some of their nuclear facilities. And the Obama administration leaked that out intentionally through CNN I watched it live when they made that announcement that this arrangement had been made, and I told my wife, I said, there is no way Israel wanted that information out. And a couple of days later, we found out that was exactly the case, and it blew their cover on that operation. And so the fact that this administration has consistently been doing everything it can to throw up roadblocks involving any action Israel is wanting to take, and is trying to force Israel into a certain solution and peace agreement in the Middle East, that does not bode well with the Lord. And then finally, the persecution of the saints. And that part hasn't really happened yet to a large degree, but I believe that's the part that will be coming, and it will happen very quickly. And when all those three things put together, I personally believe that will be the final straw, and God will judge this nation. It'll be a national judgment, and it'll be unlike anything people have ever seen. I am so certain of that in my spirit, I cannot even tell you. And that's part of my grieving as well. I understand that persecution is coming. I believe that. It's just around the corner. But even beyond that is the fact that the America that we knew, that God is going to deal heavily with it in a way that I do not want to see it happen. But at the same time, I understand why it's going to happen. And I do believe, and Rick, maybe you've talked about this on other programs, but I thought it was interesting that the men who were at the meeting with us, that there was a consensus, it seemed like, among the ones who spoke on it, that they believe that Babylon the Great, spoken of in Revelation 17 and 18, may in fact be a reference to the United States. And so if people want to take a look at those passages and read them prayerfully, I believe it may be an indication of what might be coming upon this country down the road. And again, all of this should have the effect of giving us a heightened sense of urgency to be about doing what God wants us to do in the time that's left. If all it does is scare us, that's no good. But if it scares us into action, sometimes people need a wake-up call and a jolt because
that's
nothing
right.
else works.
That's right. Gary, there's our closing music. And if America is Babylon the Great or the daughter of Babylon, if we have anything that's Babylonian in us, we're in deep, deep trouble. And you need to read Jeremiah 50 and 51, Revelation 18. One thing is for certain, God is merciful and He's long-suffering, and until the judgment falls, there is still time to repent. Just look at Nineveh. Mm-hmm. And I just opened my Bible and I looked down and I saw this. God said to Jeremiah, "Go and proclaim these words. Return, backsliding Israel. I will not cause my anger to fall on you, for I am merciful. I will not remain angry forever. Only acknowledge your iniquity, that you have transgressed against the Lord your God." I'm Rick Wiles on behalf of Gary Call. God bless.